So quite a few people have asked me how I've gotten my piano compositions to sound realistic, so I figured I'd make a video encompassing all of the concepts and techniques I applied towards writing them. I'll start by clarifying what I mean by realistic. In short, I'm not referring to whether or not it's playable by someone, but rather I'm mimicking the fidelity of a real piano recording and making it sound like an authentic performance. To give a demonstration, here are two excerpts from a piano piece I wrote. The first clip is what I deem as sounding unrealistic. The second clip is the same excerpt, but written to sound like a realistic performance. As you might agree, the second version has more expression, flow, and overall realism. I'll go into detail about the MIDI techniques involved, but first we should understand the differences between various piano plugins. If you are just looking for methods of humanizing your MIDI, I've left timestamps in the description for those sections of the video. Generally, when you're looking for digital pianos, you'll be greeted with two main kinds. There are physically modeled pianos and sample-based pianos, otherwise known as piano libraries. To briefly summarize the two, physically modeled pianos construct the piano algorithmically. This is to say that they are mathematical descriptions of real pianos and emulate the physical components that produce the sound. Some of these components include the strings, hammers, microphone placements, and more. Of course, physical modeling synthesis goes beyond just piano to musical instruments and effects of all kinds. Sample-based pianos blend a variety of recorded samples to create the piano sound. In many cases, even these piano libraries use some form of physical modeling in combination with sampling. At first, one might assume that sample-based pianos will provide a more authentic sound, since they are using real recordings. This can often be true, however, as physical modeling technology improves, it is becoming increasingly persuasive. Physically modeled pianos tend to offer far greater control over the piano. This includes control over some of the design aspects such as the piano's impedance and resonance, alongside tuning, voicing, and spectral characteristics. An important feature of some physically modeled pianos is the ability to manipulate recording types and mic positions, which is a very powerful tool for imitating real performances. Sample-based pianos nowadays offer a fair amount of control as well, while still not as much as physically modeled ones. Furthermore, they make it quicker to achieve realistic sounds. A large downside with piano libraries is that they can take up an enormous amount of disk space, which is the cost of having thousands of authentic samples. Physically modeled pianos, on the other hand, take up very little space since they're essentially just built on math. However, this also means that they are often more CPU intensive and may cause performance issues. Personally, I use both for different purposes. If I'm working on a larger piece of music where pianos are not the main components, I'll likely use libraries since they aren't as CPU intensive. I find libraries are also better for more intimate and detailed performances. However, I almost always use physically modeled pianos in my solo piano works. This is because for one, they're the only instrument, so the CPU isn't as impacted, plus I want to have control over many of the piano's characteristics. I recommend Pianotech as a great physically modeled piano. Now that we've looked at some digital pianos, we can explore writing concepts, starting with dynamics. A lot of tutorials out there for writing realistic MIDI talk about velocity randomization. While this is important for making MIDI more realistic, it is only a piece of a more important concept, dynamics. Dynamics refers to the differences in loudness and intensity between notes, sections, and other elements of music. In MIDI, velocities are values assigned to every note which allow you to manipulate the force at which the note is played and how loud, effectively allowing you to control the dynamics. While randomizing the velocity helps mimic human imperfections in a performance, you may want these variations to be subtle to leave room for more drastic changes in dynamics that convey emotion. You can randomize your velocities differently depending on speed. For example, the velocity randomization can be more dramatic in faster sections, where a pianist may have more trouble maintaining consistency in the dynamics, with slower sections having less randomization for the effect of a pianist having more control. Another thing that may lead to differences in randomization are dynamic extremes. It can be difficult for a pianist to control the tonality of a really soft section as well as a really loud section, so you can mimic this by having randomization effects being more noticeable here. Of course, you can still make these extremes sound more consistent if that's the intent. Moving on from randomization, you can also use velocity for dynamic accents. A dynamic accent in music is simply an emphasis on specific notes or chords to make them louder than their surrounding notes. Here are two examples of the same piece, with the second example using velocity to bring out the voice of an inner melody in the progression. While at first thought this may not seem linked to realism, it's important to understand that real performers accent musical elements in different ways to accentuate various tones and emotions. Some ways of achieving this are by adjusting the velocities of chords, arpeggios, melodies, and more. Finally, and more generally, you can change dynamics over an entire piece to convey different performance styles and emotions. For example, having your dynamics vary quickly and dramatically within a phrase can emulate a virtuosic and explosive performance. Here are two excerpts of the same piano passage using dynamics differently to mimic different playing styles. Now, with these concepts in mind, we can look at some MIDI techniques that shape velocity. I should clarify that I'm using Ableton, and I'll be using some tools exclusive to Max for Live. With that being said, the concepts are still applicable for all DAWs, you will just need different tools to apply them. The Ableton 12 update brought a panoply of creative and practical tools for MIDI, many of which I'll use. So, back to dynamics. Dragging individual velocities can be time-consuming and inefficient, which is why I often use the Draw tool. With the MIDI clip open, you can press B or right-click the velocity window to enable Draw mode. This enables you to hold-click over the velocity window to shape the velocity more efficiently. How many notes you affect at once with the Draw tool will depend on your grid size. You can also highlight notes and affect only those specific notes with the Draw tool. I'll often use the drawing tool to create a rough draft of my dynamic structure, and then do more specific edits afterwards, along with randomizing the shape a little bit. To give an example, I often use the draw tool to shape swells or waves in my piano writing. The next technique is velocity ramping. At the bottom of the velocity window, there is a ramp section with two values. When you select a region in the MIDI clip, you can use the ramp values to create a linear velocity slope. The first value sets the velocity of the first note in the selection, and the second value sets the velocity of the last note in the section. Then it will interpolate between them. This can be useful for quickly shaping crescendos and diminuendos. If you want to create more complex but precise slopes, you can use the Max for Live MIDI tool, Velocity Shaper, which provides a curve editor to shape the velocity. Velocity Shaper is also useful for repeating velocity patterns. Lastly, there is of course randomization, which you can control using the randomize value at the bottom of the velocity window. Alternatively, if you want the velocity to be randomized uniquely every time you replay the clip, you can use the deviation value. Now that we've explored dynamics and some velocity tools, we can move on to the next key concept, articulation. Articulation in music is the way in which notes are played. Specifically, I'll go over techniques that shape the length, attack, and decay of notes, and how to articulate using MIDI tools. Pianists can convey different tones, textures, and atmospheres with different articulations. One effective way to articulate chords is to roll them. Rolling a chord means to play the notes in succession instead of all at once. This articulation can be used to create texture, introduce rhythm, and more. Here's a demonstration that uses rolled chords to induce a water-like texture. One of the MIDI tools provided by Live 12 is Strum. With Strum, you can roll chords or any group of notes without having to individually displace the notes. In real performances, large chords may often have to be rolled by pianists that can't reach every note simultaneously. Another way to articulate notes is by reshaping their durations. The MIDI tool Span enables you to do so by providing 3 articulation styles: staccato, tenuto, and legato. A crucial feature in Span is the note length randomization, which is useful for imitating human imperfections. Furthermore, you can offset the duration of any selected notes using the offset parameter. As for the articulation styles, staccato shortens the duration of selected notes, which is good for choppy phrases among other things. Legato lengthens the duration of notes until they reach other notes, removing the silence between them. This can be useful in slower and calm sections, or possibly for making specific notes ring out longer than others. Tenuto by itself doesn't change the note lengths, but rather allows you to use the offset and variation parameters without changing the durations beforehand. Here are 2 examples of a piano passage using different articulation styles. Moving on from articulation, timing is critical for depicting realism and emotion. Timing is another foundational concept of both emotion and realism in digital piano writing. Like velocity randomization, note displacement, often referred to as humanization, can also mimic realism by slightly randomizing note timings. Similar to velocity, you can also vary note displacement depending on playing speed and other factors like difficulty. In Ableton, there is a humanization parameter inside MIDI clips which controls the amount of displacement. It's important to note that this value scales with grid size. Another convenient MIDI tool brought by Ableton 12 is Time Warp. I use Time Warp for several reasons in my writing, including building tension, timing variations, accentuating rhythm, and more. You can perform these by selecting notes and moving the breakpoints in the speed curve. The higher the breakpoint, the larger the increase in speed. This makes it easy to create accelerations and/or decelerations in speed. Moving outside of the MIDI clip, tempo automation can play a critical role in your writing workflow. Firstly, timing imperfections don't have to just be done with note displacement. Rather, you can use tempo automation to randomize timing on a larger scale. For this, I often use the draw tool to block out imperfections. Furthermore, you can use tempo to convey different emotions and playing styles. To illustrate the effectiveness of tempo automation, here is an example of a piece with and without it. I highly recommend listening to piano performances and studying how the timing shifts throughout them. Moving on to the piano itself, it is pivotal to understand and use pedal automation. The first and most commonly used pedal is the sustain pedal, which when held allows notes to ring out longer by lifting all of the dampers. This can be useful in piano writing for various reasons, including creating atmosphere, smoothing transitions, and evoking different textures. Many digital pianos allow you to automate the sustain pedal, which you can do outside of the MIDI clip. However, I prefer automating inside the MIDI clip using the MIDI CC parameter, CC64. You can access this by opening the clip, clicking on envelopes at the top, then checking at the bottom that MIDI control is chosen, and finally selecting the 64 controller in the drop-down menu. I use the draw tool for my automation and usually shape out large blocks. Some tips I can offer are to release the sustain pedal when introducing tonal shifts or chords that might not blend well with preceding sustained chords, to add short moments of sustain and choppy sections to create contrast, and to use sustain to blur arpeggios or even transition them into chords. The next pedal is the soft pedal, which softens and modifies the tonality of notes. You can automate this parameter with MIDI CC 67. I often use the soft pedal in sections preceding loud and brash moments to create a heavier contrast between them. Lastly, there is the sostenuto pedal, which acts as a selective sustain, only sustaining notes that are played when the pedal is held down. This pedal can be automated with MIDI CC 66. This pedal is sometimes misunderstood, so here is an example of how it works. The sostenuto pedal can be useful for allowing bass notes to ring out while no other notes are sustained, or vice versa. I sometimes use this pedal in sections with more complex textures. How you automate your pedals is entirely up to you, and again, I recommend studying how other piano pieces use the pedals in different ways. So that essentially includes all of the concepts I apply in my writing workflow. Still, there are things I do in post that deliver even greater realism. I often will make a quiet noise floor for my piano piece to mimic real recordings. I try to keep it subtle enough to where it doesn't interfere with the piano itself, and really it's only noticeable over quiet and soft sections. For fun, you could even add in recordings of audience members coughing or even an applause at the end. Another tip for realism is to add subtle sounds of a pianist moving or a seat creaking. This can get more intense over faster and louder sections. Additionally, if your piano VST has the option for it, you can boost mechanical noises like key release and pedal sounds. Finally, you can emulate different recording spaces by using different reverbs and convolution reverbs, and match your other sounds like the noise floor and audience sounds accordingly. There are many rabbit holes to go down when studying new forms of music and sound, so I hope this video has provided you with some new concepts to explore. I myself write a fair amount of piano music, which you can support on my Bandcamp if you want to. And of course, thanks for watching.